The other week, I was teaching some students of mine this excerpt. It's an excerpt from a book of travel writing by the writer Robert Twigger. I have read one of his books before. He's an excellent travel writer. What really struck me about teaching this particular text, though, was that the students didn't quite have a means of grappling with what was really going on, the subtext. They gave me all the information about what the person was physically doing. They gave me a few things like some of the symbolism, but they couldn't put the whole thing in context. And I realized that one of the problems was that they didn't quite know what to look for. And having discovered that, I went through the text with them, and I'll read it for you in just a second so you can see what it's about. But what struck me after going through them is that there was this immediate, aha, now I get it moment. And the reason for that was because they had been reading this as a piece of nonfiction travel writing, when in fact, the author was writing a piece of, well, mythology. Now, what do I mean by mythology? Well, I don't really mean that he was talking about ancient gods and goddesses or anything like that. Rather, the writer was employing this sort of mythological grammar, in this case, an ascent up a mountain where he had a spiritual experience. This kind of writing is used time and time again, the use of mythological structure as a means of talking about our experiences. In fact, I would say that all of our experiences can fall into these mythological structures, whether they be going up a mountain for a spiritual experience, going out into the wilderness to be by ourselves, or entering society as a means of engaging more people. All of these fit into a kind of mythological grammar. And so what I want to do today is to go through that section that we talked about with our students and to examine just how the writer uses mythological images to phrase and to give meaning to this experience. So as I said, the writer is Robert Twigger. The book is called In Search of Paradise. I've never read it before, but I'm assuming it's talking about his travels in Egypt because that is where the extract takes place. I don't think there's much more backstory we need than that. So here we go. This is the excerpt of Robert Twigger, Lost Oasis in Search of Paradise. It was a canyon of great promise. The cliffs were 300 or more feet high and rose in a concave curve to an abrupt, crumbly steepness at the top. They looked impossible to climb. I was cowed by the canyon's vastness, content at first to leap from boulder to boulder along its rocky bottom. There were plants but no trees. Gravel slides, rounded hillocks of shale and side wadis winding into rocky clefts in the canyon walls. The air was brilliantly clear. Bright blue sky in front, and, when I turned to look back, the city squatting under a foggy haze. You could actually see the start of the smog, worryingly near the place where my kids' school was. But as I walked up the canyon, I turned my back on it. In the ultra-clear air of the desert, you can see as far as you want to. Small details are visible far away. The falcon floating in the distance above the canyon top was like an ink stroke, a precise piece of calligraphy. There were 2 ruined blockhouses in the wadi, remnants of its time as a military training area. These became my landmarks. I would reach them quickly and decide where to explore. On the ground I found fossils, but no stone tools. I followed a path up a rocky defile and rediscovered the pleasure of hauling myself up short boulder faces. Each sub-wadi was a series of steps that water had once poured down. They looked unclimbable, but up close there was almost always a way. Under the cliffs were animal tracks and burrows, but for days I saw no animals, only birds, including the black and white wheat-eater, the zerzur, after which Zerzura had been named. At the top of the side wadi, I was on the plain, flat and gravelly. In the far distance were new tower blocks being built. Ahead, it was clear to the horizon, and behind, in the hollow of the Nile Valley, lay Cairo under its pall of grayness. I had been keen on rock climbing when I was younger, but it had been years since I had done any. I was surprised to find I'd become trepidatious about heights, nervous about scrambling up shale cliffs. Slowly, I regained the old skills needed, not pausing too long on a hand or foothold, not thinking too much, just moving upwards. Instead of seeing unclimbable vertiginous cliffs, I began to see routes, ways up and out of the canyon. I deliberately sighted up a possible route and found my way quite easily to the very top edge. The drop made me keep clear of the edge, gave my knees a slight wobble. Looking across the canyon, which was maybe a half kilometer wide, The plains on the other side stretched away to hills marked only by a distant radio tower. Coming down the same way, I saw my first desert fox. Not a big-eared finnick, but a red fox. I sat still and watched it as it watched me. The time spent watching in the cool, clear, high-up air was like an inner breath of some neglected part of me, which neutralized the heavy sense of self, made me transparent again. Okay, so just the first thing to note about this, just quite clearly the writer is detailing how he climbed up this canyon, which is a few miles away from Cairo, and despite the fact that he hadn't climbed a canyon since he was quite young and was even a little bit trepidatious about going up the heights, nevertheless he goes up and finds the going gets progressively easier the closer he gets to the top. He is able from the top to command a good view of Cairo, seeing much of the desert in front of him, and then coming back down, he sees his first desert fox, despite the fact that there are not a lot of wild animals or vegetation in the area. He then concludes by saying that this encounter of watching the fox in this out-of-the-way place restored a sense of his own youth to him, and he even says it neutralized the heavy sense of self, made him transparent again. So what exactly is going on here, and how is this a mythological image? Well, just the first thing to note is the place that all this is happening in, which is Egypt. Now, for a Western reader, we can't escape the romance that Egypt commands for us. This is Egypt in the Nile Valley, the birthplace of all life, the place from which culture and civilization have their first roots, at least, again, for a Westerner. Now, Twigger plays with that image a little bit. First of all, despite the fact that this is near the Nile River, near the Nile Valley, again, this great sort of oasis of life, there is a lot of death that he talks about. He mentions that there isn't a lot of vegetation. He mentions that there are fossils but no tools. He mentions that he doesn't really see any creatures around this area as well. So once more, despite the fact that this was a fertile place, right now it's a place of death. Twigger goes farther than that. He characterizes the death of this place with humanity itself. When he talks about ascending up the cliff, he looks over and he sees the place where his kid's school is under this foggy haze. We're supposed to read this as the threat of human civilization encroaching upon the beauty of undisturbed, pristine nature. We also have this idea, as he goes towards the cliff, of these old military facilities that were one-time training grounds. Now they're abandoned. So what Twigger is communicating to us is not only the threat that humanity presents to this area, but also the fact that it is a perishable civilization, just as those military training facilities are now shells of their former place. So human civilization is fated to pass away. And what this does is magnifies the sense of, I might almost say, the uncanny, which would be the power of nature over man. However, the true trajectory of this passage is when the writer begins to climb up the cliff. We can't forget the first sentence of this passage. It was a canyon of great promise. That naturally implies a promise of what? And although that question is never explicitly answered, we could probably answer it having come to the end of the passage. It is a promise of life. It is a promise of renewal. It is a promise of a new perspective. All of the things that we get when we ascend a mountain. Remember, in the quintessential mountain ascension story, which is Moses up Mount Sinai, he comes back down with the commandments of God, which is a whole new way of being human, a whole new way of living. So we go up the mountain in order to have a change in perspective. So then, what exactly is changing for the writer? Well, for one, the writer talks about how initially he's trepidatious. He hasn't done this sort of climbing since his youth, and although at one time he enjoyed it, now old age or middle-aged has made him a little bit wary about these sorts of dangers. Another thing that changes is that in the beginning, he thinks these cliffs are impassable. He can see no way up. In fact, he even says as much explicitly. However, once Twigger actually gets climbing, all of these details and all of these difficulties seem to fall away. He starts to find roots up that he couldn't see in the beginning. He starts to see more than he could before. His perspective literally grows. His sense of himself literally grows. And once more, as he ascends, his old age or his middle age begins to drop off. He is in fact reclaiming who he was as a youth. So this is both a widening of his perspective, but also a reclaiming of who he once was in order to really create a kind of new perspective. So the ascension up the mountain is what starts this process of self-renewal. However, it's not made explicit until we actually get to the fox. You will recall that he was talking about not seeing a lot of animals and about the sparsity of the vegetation. Although there were birds and although there were tracks, there is really no sign of the animal. However, once he has made the ascension and is coming back down, it is at this point that he sees the fox. Now, the mythology of the fox also should not be lost on a Western reader. Foxes are often crafty, they are often even malicious, but they are in a sense otherworldly. They're a little bit like dogs, that is tame, that is able to have this communion with man, but they are wild as well. So they combine these two elements, both the tame and the wild, which is why the fox is also a predominant image in that great mythological text, The Little Prince. Here what happens is that there is just a shared moment of the narrator looking at the fox. But what is actually happening here? Well, you might say it is the wild in the fox meeting the wild in man. Man is rediscovering something essential about his nature. He is rediscovering something that he forgot he had lost, like his lost youth. And what does this do for him? Well, he says that there is a part of him which is neutralized. The heavy sense of self has been neutralized. That part of his humanity, which is, you might say, responsible for the smog in Cairo, responsible for the destructive element of man as seen in the military bases, that is replaced by literally a new spirit. What does he say? He says the rarefied air, the cool, clear, high-up air was like an inner breath of some neglected part of me. He literally is getting a new spirit. And what does this spirit do? It makes him transparent again. That is, it makes him, well, light, buoyant. That is, it literally makes him like a heavenly figure, or at least closer to the heavens, because of course light things are what float up to the top. So in all these ways, he is describing how he ascended up to a high point that is very close to heaven. He had an encounter with a kind of wildness that he did not consciously understand, but intuitively understood. And as a result, he then felt a new sense of spirit come into him, which brought him closer to the heavens. That is the story that Twigger's outlining here. Now, you might say that, of course, he's just talking about going up a cliff. And yes, that is true. That is the physical narration that he is detailing. But what does it actually mean? That's the question. And that is what mythology is designed to answer. Not questions of what happened, but what is meaningful about what happened. So the next time you go through a text, whenever you see these mythological images going up a mountain or going into the wilderness or encounters of various natures, you might ask yourself not only what physically is happening, but why is it important? What does it mean? Hi guys, thank you so much for watching that. If you enjoyed that, go ahead and consider subscribing to my channel or also following me on Substack. And if you really like what I do, you might also consider checking out my book, Cheers! Around the World in 80 Toasts, a compendium of all the different ways to toast around the world. Thank you so much. Happy reading.